Do not obey in advance. It's the first rule of On Tyranny, Timothy Snyder's Guide to Resisting Authoritarianism, and one you've probably seen quoted more than any other. In theory, it's an easy instruction to agree with. We shout it online. We demand it of our institutions. We demand it of our leaders. But let's be honest, are we all really living by it? Have you kept your head down in meetings, in friend groups, in family gatherings just to avoid confrontation? Have you held your tongue because it was easier than speaking up? Have you made peace with the line between what's tolerable and what's too much instead of standing firm against injustice, even in its early stages? I have. During Trump's first run for office in his first term, I was working in Washington, D.C. on the government affairs and policy staff of one of the country's largest and most important congressionally chartered veteran service organizations. These VSOs are supposed to be nonpartisan. They're supposed to be putting veterans and military families first. But many have struggled to reckon with the damage that Trumpism and MAGA have done, not just to civil society, but to the very people that they claim to serve. While working there, I was lucky enough to have been under leadership of my personal heroes, Rick Weidman and John Rowan at Vietnam Veterans America, two men who'd been speaking truth to power for half a century. VVA itself came out of the anti-war movement long before it was politically safe to criticize American militarism. They had the courage to speak out when others stayed silent, and they gave me room to do the same. We made a deal. I could speak out publicly, even if I was critical of Trump, so long as my comments were rooted in facts, policy, and data. As long as I debated in good faith and didn't cross over into partisan flamethrowing, I had cover. But that came with a limit. It meant that I wasn't absolutely free to say everything I wanted to say. I walked right up to the line, and sometimes I crossed it just a little bit. There were times that I posted criticism of the administration and followed it by drafting an email offering to resign if my boss felt that I had gone too far. Trump's allies in the veteran space were calling for my firing all the time, but Rick always had my back. Still, there were things that I left unsaid. I accepted that line. I obeyed in advance. And despite all of the emails offering to resign, I knew I was safe. I wasn't going to be fired or demoted. I wasn't going to be blackballed from the field. I was protected. I was privileged. Looking back, I don't know if I regret it. I don't know if it was a smart strategic compromise or if I was just being a coward. Was I really willing to risk anything? Was I doing enough? Because I've watched others do more, take greater risks, put more on the line. I've seen people move from theory to action with clarity and courage that I admire and sometimes I envy. One of those people is my friend Rachel Cohen. Rachel is a Harvard Law grad, a former big law associate, and one of the clearest, most unapologetic voices in the fight against authoritarianism. She quit her job at Skadden, a big law firm, before they capitulated to Trump. She put her body on the line before ICE announced mass operations in Chicago or Minneapolis. She got arrested, not after things escalated, but to stop them from escalating. She is not just resisting authoritarianism, she is intervening. And her example demands something from us. This episode is an invitation to test your own red lines, to stop waiting for the perfect moment, to get uncomfortable. Because we all like to believe we'd be the ones who stood up in Selma or hid our neighbors from the Gestapo. But the truth is, we only get to make that choice in the present. So ask yourself, what are we really willing to risk? So, Rachel Cohen, thank you so much for joining me for On Offense. I am a tremendous fan. I think I probably found you with your first viral video early last year. Watched the whole saga of you trying to encourage your then unnamed employer to try to do the right thing when it came to the Trump administration. And you have only since become a much more powerful voice in this movement of resisting against tyranny. So can you kind of talk about how you stepped into this creator space and how all of a sudden you went from just a lawyer, a Harvard educated one at a big corporate law firm, to someone who a lot of folks are reaching out to inspire them and to instruct them on how to engage with this fascism that we're seeing in our country?
Kris, thank you so much for having me. And I think I do just have to clarify that we are not just fans of each other's work. We are also friends. And I think that's okay to say. But really glad to have you. And also looking forward to talking a little bit more about the journey in the creator space, because I think that many people know me from last year when I resigned from my former employer, Skadden, but I had been in the creator space exclusively on TikTok for a really long time. I started making videos during the pandemic quarantine in 2020, and they resonated with people more than I expected. My bio, at least in a couple of places, still might be anti-niche, but often political. And it's because on my TikTok, I was talking about my dating life. I was talking about being a law student. I was talking about the Supreme Court and law school application processes and also politics. And it was super disorganized and very touch and go in terms of how many views I was getting and what I was talking about. And when I really started to crystallize on TikTok in particular and really understand the weight that my voice could hold when amplifying arguments that were being made by non-white people or people who didn't have Harvard degrees or both, was in 2023 after the October 7th attack, when I was pretty immediately critical of Israeli response to October 7th and felt very strongly that when we were talking about the kind of geopolitical situation in the Middle East, that we needed to view it in an extended context of occupation and et cetera. And so in that moment, there were not a lot of white Americans making those points. There were not a lot of people. I don't practice. I'm several generations removed from when my family practiced Judaism, but I have a very Jewish name, and my great-grandfather came to the United States fleeing the pogroms in Belarus, and that was particularly uncommon, and my law firm did not like it. My social media presence had never been an issue prior to the fall of 2023, and despite having really measured conversations about pretty much exclusively exactly what I just said to you and pressuring people to think in like a longer context the way that America should have after 9/11, frankly, as opposed to reacting in a specific way that was militaristic and drives additional resentment of the United States because of mass murder campaigns abroad at the hands of politicians who are getting pressured by like defense company executives. That was the first time that they had had any kind of issue with what I was saying online. And in that moment, it was very scary, and I thought I was going to lose my job, and ultimately did not. But I realized and tested myself and knew that I was willing to lose my job if I felt that it was necessary and that I was doing good work and work that was moving people. I remember having people come up to me on the street in 2023 and tell me that I had changed their mind about what we should be supporting as a reaction in the Middle East in that moment. And as somebody who is ultimately pretty pacifist and who has met both of my parents, were in the Air Force, and so I have a lot of love for many military members and do not want people shipped abroad to also put themselves in harm's way for the sake of corporate interests. I was really moved by that and committed to it. And so when this now finally gets us to the point where most people actually know me from, and so I'll try and zip through this because I think it's more likely that your guests are familiar. In February and March of 2023, the Trump administration started entering executive orders that targeted large corporate law firms as a kind of entry point into attacking the legal industry broadly, which is necessary to dismantle due process rights. It's necessary to create the world we're seeing right now, where it is nearly impossible for people to effectively challenge illegal actions done by ICE agents and other agents of the state in court, because it's totally inaccessible, and there's this kind of plausible deniability of ignoring court orders or saying that people haven't had access to or the court system and that that's okay. Setting that aside, maybe we can loop back to that, because that is a long-term feature of this system, and we are just now, I think, at a point where the average person who's never had to interact with it is realizing that that is a feature of the system. And I want to make very clear to your listeners that that is not a Trump 2.0 kind of invention, this lack of access to due process in the American legal system, particularly in immigration court. And I, once again, felt the need to use my platform, which at the time was still exclusively on TikTok, was not so large. I think I had maybe 150,000 followers on TikTok only, but it felt like a huge cop-out not to use that platform to talk about what was happening, because one of my great critiques was that people weren't covering these attacks on big law firms as attacks on the broader legal industry. And I knew that one of the reasons they weren't was because people didn't fully understand it, because you kind of had to be an insider to fully put the pieces together. And so started using my platform to talk about what was happening, ended up reaching an impasse with my employer where it felt clear to me that they were going to let me kick and scream and tire myself out and then fire me like down the line when nobody cared anymore, because they handled it really differently from how they handled conversations around my content about Palestine. Mm-hmm. And so I could tell that they weren't seriously considering terminating me in that moment. But I also knew how the industry worked and knew that I was torpedoing my career, right? And so I'd already sat with the idea that I'm willing to lose my job over these particular issues. And I also knew that it would break through a little bit more to see someone actually willing to give something up, and found myself saying, if it's as serious as I think it is, I would give that up. And so resigned. It got a lot more attention than I expected. I resigned 10 days before Skadden entered into an agreement with the Trump administration, because I felt it was important to be proactive instead of reactive, because if there was any chance that those actions might change things before they happened, I wanted to take them, even though then it meant kind of taking a risk and maybe they didn't do anything at all and I looked silly and had given up my job for nothing. Over the summer, I was really trying to amplify ICE Watch efforts before the increased presence was announced, and ended up being arrested for civil disobedience outside of the Broadview processing facility in Broadview, Illinois, to drive foot traffic there for protests the week before Donald Trump announced that it was going to be headquarters for Operation Midway Blitz. Mm-hmm. And so I think that notion of, I can't be sure what's going to happen because it hasn't happened yet, but if I have a really strong sense of what's going to happen, even if I don't want to believe it, even if I think it's really unlikely, maybe I should just act in the way that I would if I knew that that was true.
Now, one of the things that I'm really curious about is, when did you make the decision, like you made your decision to leave this relatively comfortable job that you could have just had kept your head down and make a ton of money? When did you decide to go from that to actually being on the streets and saying, come get arrested with me? Like, when did that shift happen?
I was doing that already. I just wasn't posting about it. And I also wasn't putting myself at a point where I could get arrested, because it would have probably been an issue at work. But going out to protests, I did only make it to one encampment during Palestine because my hours were so long. And so during the Palestinian encampments, obviously there is still violence and genocide happening in Palestine. But I was very involved in protest in 2020. I was in Columbus, Ohio at the time. And I think in 2020, that was the first time that I was involved in the kind of confrontational protest that I think is so necessary right now, as opposed to, you know, a women's march kind of showing of community, solidarity, yeah, but not really coming for the agents of the state that are doing the harm. And I think, you know, No Kings has its place, but I think if you've been to a No Kings event and you have not been to a smaller, more confrontational protest that is aimed at slowing down or disrupting ICE operations, that's a shame. And you should really consider pushing yourself to do that. And that's the decision to start documenting that was because I realized that since the 2020 uprisings, which was the first time that I was tear gassed, the first time I was pepper sprayed, it had been 5 years, and many people were no longer kind of at that comfort level. We'd had the kind of denouement of COVID, which is also, of course, still ongoing. We like to pretend all of these things are over when really we've just decided to accept them a lot of the time, when we shouldn't have. And I think people needed to see how to do those things. And I now had all of this free time. Well, not all of this free time, but all of this control over my schedule. And that felt really important to me.
One of the things that I struggle with, and I talked on my first episode with Tad Sturmer, our mutual friend, about this, is I no longer do protests. You know, people say that I'm brave and shit, and, you know, like, neo-Nazis have literally tried to kill me. I've been swatted, like, all of these really terrible fucking things have come with my work. But I don't do protests because I don't respond well to confrontation. And I know myself well enough to know that if people start getting hurt, like, the same spirit of justice that I have in my words will come out in actions, and it'll be in a way that is going to take me off the field. And I'm no longer going to be effective for the movement. So between us, between someone who does not go to protests because I am afraid of what I will do, and someone like you who does this all the time and is throwing your full weight of your existence behind it, not just your name and your face, it's your life. Can you tell people what it's like to actually be arrested, as you somewhat recently have? Like, what impact does it have? I think a lot of us, and I've been arrested at protests, which is part of the reason that I don't do it anymore. But the idea of being arrested, it terrifies a lot of Americans, and for a lot of good reasons. But could you tell us why you're comfortable with it? Like, what the reality of your experience has been?
I was comfortable with it in theory, and then the night before was really uncomfortable and stressed. And I think sitting with those emotions was very important. I think that I have been talking a little bit this week about the idea of objective fear, like objectively reasonable fear. You should have that fear. Of course, you should be afraid of a certain outcome. And subjective reasonable fear, or true fear, which is, yes, I'm feeling this fear, but is that based in reality, or is that just how I'm feeling? And I think that for a lot of white Americans, the fear of an arrest, and particularly in the way that I was fearing being arrested, which was in a sitting down civil disobedience event in Broadview before Operation Midway Blitz, before there were huge numbers of feds all around. That was a subjective fear and not remotely objectively reasonable. At this point, I work at a place where, mostly for myself and partly for people who are not going to penalize me for a civil disobedience arrest. And I also was not going to, I think a lot about what's the what's truly the worst thing that can happen to someone that is this insulated and protected? And if I'm not willing to take this risk on, how on earth can I ask other people to take this risk on because of how well situated I am? Mm-hmm. And so I think that when I looked at it objectively and prior to the night before and really thought it through, it felt like a no-brainer. I knew that I could drive a lot of attention to this facility, that I could do it and get people to start thinking about what their lines were and what risks they were willing to take before Donald Trump stepped up mass immigration enforcement and disappearances in the Chicagoland area, and that it would cost me very, very little. Even though I ended up getting the best possible case scenario, I pretty much just got a ticket. I paid a $100 fine. It was possible that there could have been different levels of charges. And we've now seen the federal government being much more likely to bring federal charges against people when they are arrested for peaceful protest, though they're having a lot of trouble consistently obtaining indictments against those people. But it is a slightly elevated, I mean, I would say a significantly elevated risk, right, to future employment prospects, to current employment. And I think that it's really important for people to remember that those kinds of additional risks and the kind of go forward impacts that it can have on your life and your career, that those have been the reality for particularly Black Americans in certain parts of certain cities in this country since its inception. And so the kind of idea that, and people, I've been posting about this, and I have occasionally people saying, well, that's not true. Like the idea that a white person who's impeding a federal officer has the same level of risk as a Black person walking down the street is just absurd. And I disagree with that pushback. I think that they really, really don't get it, because it is true that the consequences are much more certain if you are impeding, a federal officer in this way. But the consequences are usually still less than a Black man who is picked up for being in a park that a city has determined is, based off nothing, is a place that gangs hang out. And that is the reality of our criminal legal enforcement system, is that, and this is not exclusive to Black people, and it's also very, very class driven, right? And so you have these people who are really worried about, oh my gosh, what if I have go forward job consequences, who work in white collar jobs for people who are not going to fire them because of a protest arrest. And a reality for low income Americans that an arrest almost always results in job loss because there are missed shifts, or there's pretrial detention in cities and states that require bond and people can't afford it. And so I think that all of that to say, arrest is going to vary. Your results are going to vary. And I think that consequences are going to get much more severe than what they were for me the first time I was arrested, because the Trump administration is desperately trying to intimidate people out of standing up for their neighbors. It's trying to make people feel like they are in a protected class that's insulated from harm so that they stay home while the Trump administration continues to consolidate power. And when it decides that it wants to start coming for white people who vote blue, then what have you done? There's been no dismantling. And so people will just stop, and they'll just, if you don't have the kind of wherewithal to engage now, and that does not mean that you have to get arrested, right? And I think that, Kris, the frame that you provided of being someone that doesn't really go to protests, I want to just name that. I think that's exactly right. Like, I think we have to know where we are most useful. And as an articulate, relatively conventionally attractive, well-connected white woman with a big social media following and a really, really powerful network, where I can be really effective is by being on the front lines and encouraging other people who are similarly insulated to do so as well. Not because the risks are zero, but because the risks that we are choosing to take onto ourselves still result in lower consequences than when the state decides to randomly pick a black or brown person to intimidate them. And I know I'm going to get comments if I don't mention it. I know that you'll get comments about, well, how can Rachel say that when Renee Good was just murdered? And I think that I want to be very clear that when I say these things, at no point am I saying that there is no risk whatsoever. You probably will get arrested if you're engaging in impeding things in this moment. But there are literally thousands of people who are missing in immigration detention who were just picked up off the street for doing nothing. And there is one white woman who has been murdered by the state. And I think that that is something that people really, really need to sit with. Are you only going to get involved if the risk to you is literally zero, or are you going to get involved because you're protected?
I think that a lot of people have been looking at ICE, have been seeing these videos from people who are on the ground like yourself, and they are seeing a lot of violence, and they are seeing snatch and grabs, like they're targeting very specific protesters. They're moving in formations, like I would in a combat zone. They're wearing a hell of a lot better equipment than I had when I was in Iraq. In terms of combat readiness and effectiveness. What authorities do ICE actually have against protesters like yourself? They seem to be acting like, I describe them as like the Gestapo. Like they're just randomly assaulting people at this point. They're not even trying to arrest them. They're just assaulting them. What powers does ICE have? What happens to someone to a protester when they're detained by ICE? Is that an arrest? Is that something different because they're ICE?
It's not a formal arrest. It's like a detention because ICE isn't empowered because they're civil law enforcement. So they're empowered to detain people when they have, this is not the exact legal standard, but basically they can detain people who they think are not in the country legally. And they can't enforce state laws or federal laws even about kind of protest and arrest you for those things in that way. But they are detaining people. And I think that we could get into a really complicated legal question of what authority does ICE really have and like what recourse is there really in terms of what the law says. But I think that the answer is a lot simpler than that. ICE has the authority that we allow at this point, because Stephen Miller has empowered ICE to do whatever the fuck they want. And so is that actually the legal authority of an ICE agent? No. But there have been really excellent and effective legal challenges to excessive use of force of ICE agents in at least the Chicagoland area. I'm sure they've happened elsewhere. I just pay close attention to the city in which I live. And they don't give a shit. Like, they don't follow the judge's order. They continue to target press. They continue to target specific protesters, to use excessive force, to blanket streets in residential neighborhoods with carcinogenic chemical agents, some of which are banned under the Geneva Convention. And so it's very clear that the U.S. government believes that ICE has whatever power it wants to do whatever it wants, because, as you said, they are trying to build out the secret police force and really have people regard it that way. And so they have the power that we allow. And that is why it is so crucial in this moment where the power is being determined that people show up and say, you don't have this power, actually. You don't. And I am willing to put my body and some aspects of my go forward future on the line, because I know what happens if I don't do that. It goes back to this idea of proactivity. I know what is coming if we do not intervene. And I will say very plainly that what I believe is coming, but for effective intervention and resistance, is continued funding of ICE, them as a quote unquote law enforcement agency that reports directly to the executive branch to continue to function as Stephen Miller and or Donald Trump's secret police, to continue to disappear people, to move them all over the place without access to due process, and ultimately to use that agency to make it impossible to have free and fair democratic elections in the years to come and have us transition to a soft dictatorship. That's what I think happens if we do not act. And when I feel that way so deeply, and I think that because Donald Trump is selling Trump 2028 hats on his website, because he's saying that he wants to run again, because the whole administration is saying that. And so you have to believe what people tell you. There's a really, this was about to be a crazy, I was about to say there's a really excellent quote from Adolf Hitler. But there's a really, I think, telling quote from Adolf Hitler giving a speech about his disregard for the Treaty of Versailles, where he basically says, instead of sitting around debating what I meant, people would have been really well served to read everything I had ever written. Like, we know what's coming, and I can tell people it's only going to get harder, and it's only going to get worse for their neighbors, and the time to act is very, very much now.
Can you describe the like how it actually went down when you got arrested? Like, were you handcuffed? Were you brought to the station? Did you stay overnight? Were you chained to a bench? Those are all things that my arrest included. One of my friends had his skull crushed by a police horse who was also chained next to me, which is part of the reason I just can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
But what was your physical experience like getting arrested?
They asked me to stand up and told me I was under arrest. In the state of Illinois, there's case law that says that if you go limp, they can add a resisting arrest charge and it will probably be upheld. And it didn't feel worth baiting. And so I stood up, they cuffed me, put me in the back of a police car, took me to the municipal building in Broadview, which is where their police station and holding cells are. I was in a holding cell for 2 hours while they processed me, and then I was given a hearing date in an administrative court in Broadview for a month or two later, and was home by like noon. And that is not going to be everyone's experience. And even at Broadview right now, it wouldn't be everyone's experience. They're much more likely to take people to process them at Cook County Jail now. Mm-hmm. But I think it really speaks to people sometimes view being a first mover as intense and particular bravery, but being a first mover or an early mover often means that you are actually at lower risk, because there has not been severe retaliation in the same way. The state doesn't view the need in the same way. And that's why I'm trying to get people to the streets now, because I know that it seems scary, because it is scary. But right now, like when I was in Minneapolis, I got pepper sprayed in like such close range in the face and then like shoved to the ground while I couldn't see anything. But even that, if there is not effective resistance, it's not going to be pepper spray. It's going to be, we've already seen protesters shot with quote unquote less lethal rounds. And we've already seen people shot with live rounds. Like, those kinds of things get normalized when you don't turn up, and they become more common, and the risk becomes greater actually if you allow the government to consolidate power in this way. And so I'm very pro being a first mover, because I think that I think outside people looking say, oh, that feels so much scarier, I'll wait until everyone does it. But there's never gonna, I think that Iran is honestly maybe worth looking at in this moment. And I'm not at all saying that as and the Iranian people just didn't rise up soon enough, because that's not what happened. But I think that we can see what happens to regime change protesters in a place where the government has been able to consolidate power almost completely. And that is mass murder of protesters who turn out to the streets. And it becomes really the only pathway to dislodging this authoritarian government. And so we act now, or we put ourselves at significantly more risk down the line, or our children at significantly more risk down the line.
Yeah, I think that the quickness with which the Department of Homeland Security came out and Kristi Noem came out and called Renee Nicole Good a terrorist should help people understand that the Trump administration is trying to create a permission structure to justify killing Americans.
Yep.
That is it, full stop. It goes beyond arrest. It is, judge, jury, and executioner on the street is an ICE agent who's a civil law enforcement agent, not supposed to be there for criminal law. They can just start killing people.
Kris, have you talked about NSPM 7 on here?
I have not gone at length about it. I have written about it. So for folks who have not heard of this, it's called the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which followed an executive order naming Antifa as a terrorist organization. I'm wearing an anti-fascist shirt. Like, I run an organization called Veterans Fighting Fascism. I'm very clearly Antifa. And proudly following in the footsteps of my grandfather and all the granduncles who fought fascists in Europe. And I'm a veteran of the largest Antifa organization in world history, the United States Army. So, but the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7 started to give teeth to that, what felt like a really easy to knock down executive order. And then that was followed by Pam Bondi issuing an order to all of the law enforcement agencies to treat anti-fascists as terrorists. What do you think that designation, that the presidential memorandum, the order from Bondi, and the executive order, what effect does that have on you and people on the ground, and what do people need to do about that new reality?
The reason that I ask is because I think that it's such obvious infrastructure being built out in line with what you've said about Renee Good being designated a domestic terrorist by Kristi Noem immediately after the state murdered her. That's not an isolated incident. That's what we're going to see over and over again. When I encountered Greg Bovino at a speedway in Minneapolis, as 15 ICE agents were circling my car as I got into it and writing down my plates and trying to intimidate me, they were calling me an out-of-state rioter because it was obviously a rental. Fam, I was in Minneapolis, and look, we just stumbled upon Greg Bovino at a fucking speedway for a pre-Hague photo shoot. So good for him, I guess. For those following along at home, I have nothing against short men, but I do just have to report back there is about a 4-inch height difference. Do you want to get closer so they can see?
Oh, no, a little higher than for you.
Still not the same. So Greg, you're standing right there in front of me, but to everyone following along at home, I hope you fucking eat shit. I hope this keeps you up at night for the rest of your life, and no one fucking wants you here. Oh, fantastic language. There's children in here, in your fucking vehicle, asshole. Choke. And that kind of consent farming is what the government wants to do to continue to build out apparatuses that allow it to randomly execute protesters like Renee Good and justify it for the sake of trying to keep people intimidated out of resisting. And so, and also when I say manufacturing consent, I mean with the MAGA base. And I think that we have to remember, I don't say this to let people off the hook or say that they have no personal responsibility for their own media consumption, but I do think we have to remember that a huge swath of the United States is constantly being fed propaganda by television channels that call themselves news, that you should be able to trust our news because it's in their fucking name, and also by the literal White House and the President of the United States. And I think that it's very easy to say, oh, these people, like, how do they not break through it? Well, they don't break through it because the news and the president and all of their neighbors are saying that certain things are true. And so now we have gotten to a point where they really will deny the evidence of their eyes and ears, watching a video of Renee Good driving around an ICE agent saying that the man's life was in danger. But on the whole, they've gotten there because they have been inundated in propaganda, and that is the purpose of NSPM 7, is to continue to build out that propaganda apparatus so that they can convince people who are never going to set foot in Minneapolis, are never going to set foot in Chicago and see the reality of what's happening on the ground, to convince people that murdering the people they are detaining, murdering protesters, that's justified. And I think that what a lot of people think is a ways down the line is already here.
Mm-hmm. On that note, we know that over 30 people were killed in ICE or died in ICE custody last year. I, as a threat analyst, can say that I expect that number to rise next year. We've seen this execution on camera from multiple angles. But in what's going on behind the gates, behind locked doors at places like Broadview Detention Center, there have been allegations of things like torture. There have been allegations, which I'm going to take them as fact because of everything that I've seen makes this sound very true. There are things like unsanitary conditions. There's a lack of proper food and medicine. There are women who are pregnant who cannot get the care that they need to end up delivering a healthy baby. Are you hearing these stories of torture? Is that the type of thing that you're hearing about at Broadview? Yes,
absolutely.
Can you describe what people are experiencing behind those gates?
So Broadview, and this is happening in Minnesota as well, is that the people that are being abducted are being detained at the federal building, Whipple, which is not a detention facility, and then almost immediately shipped out to other places in Texas almost overnight, so that lawyers cannot file habeas petitions on their behalf to get them released. And so, because you have to file that where the people are, which is just, the legal system is bullshit, but I think that it's very important to name that kind of torture in detention in the United States is not exclusively a feature of new era Trump immigration detention centers, right? We see as a country with an incredibly high population of people in incarceration for the sake of, frankly, free labor and for the sake of lining the pockets of private prison companies and other companies that contract with prisons. I have done legal work with incarcerated people before, and the vast majority of people, especially in long-term incarceration, have a story of an experience that most of us would classify, and perhaps the Geneva Convention would classify, as torture. And in what I do think is different in immigration detention is that people are not being held for crimes, and the torture is unacceptable whether or not people are being held for crimes. But we're seeing just these huge numbers of people held in facilities that are not built to hold them, and so it's like everyone is experiencing torture. It's unavoidable, as opposed to the province of a particularly sadistic guard who's never going to be held to account, as is often the case or a particularly sadistic superintendent. This is just the nationwide policy in these facilities. And in Broadview specifically, which is where I'm the most familiar because there was a pretty extensive class action lawsuit filed, Broadview, we know, does not have functioning showers. Broadview, we know, does not have bed capacity for the number of people that were being detained there. Broadview, we know, and we've seen, there was a teenage boy who came to drop off his father's medication, who was told to do so, who was hit with chemical weapons as he was attempting to drop off his father's medication. There are allegations of people who are so old that they no longer have control of their faculties all the way, soiling themselves and being left in overcrowded rooms that are being used as prison cells. People can't lay down. People can't. It reminds me of conditions that I learned about. It's very easy to jump and say conditions I learned about in, Germany in the 30s in camps. But I think also really, really important to name conditions that we learned about in American history in treatment of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Genuinely, these kind of rooms where people can't even lay down, that I would read about as a kid as just like the ultimate horror, being detained there for days at a time. And that's stuff that we've heard come out of Portland, that people are being detained at length in facilities that are not meant for detention. I am sure that we will hear it come out of Minneapolis, because again, they are detaining them in the federal building. And so it's not just that we believe these allegations because we've heard everything else, though certainly I do for that reason. There are certain allegations that can only be true because it has to be true that people do not have adequate space to lay down and to take care of themselves.
The numbers don't lie.
Exactly. We know how many people are being detained per the government, and we know what those facilities look like on the inside. So we know it has to be true.
If Donald Trump declares martial law, something he's been flirting with since, halfway through his first presidency, or to be specific, invoking the Insurrection Act, do you see Americans being detained and held in conditions that way en masse? Do you think that is what the Trump administration's desired outcome is here? And how do you think that Americans are going to respond to that? Because I think that the indifference, we've talked about the birth of empathy in our lives, that deep empathy, right? The fact is not everybody listening to this, may have the same type of empathy. Certainly, Americans watching Fox News all the time are cheering along ICE agents, right? There's tens of millions of Americans who strongly, strongly support this shit. When it's Americans being detained that way, do you think that it's just going to be normalized like all of the other things that we've been watching happen? Do you think that Americans are just going to accept it? Or do you think that there's going to be some sort of like final, the response that we've been waiting for this whole time, for the average American to wake up and realize it's time to get involved?
Americans have already accepted it, right? Because I think that it cannot be missed that this is possible because the vast majority of Americans have accepted disproportionately non-white people and overwhelmingly poor people being put in incarceration for low-level crimes for extended periods of time and working for slave wages in criminal detention. That acceptance is what gets us to accepting that form of immigration detention that Americans have also accepted, because of course there are some American citizens that are being detained in this way, but I think that your point about it being people in mass is well taken, and we're not seeing that happen in mass. It's still like very protective to be a U.S. citizen, and particularly protective to be a white U.S. citizen in this moment. But we, as a society, already accepted mass detention of people in really horrible conditions and viewed it as a fact of life for the sake of perceived safety. And we will either need to wake up to that reality and do dismantling work that goes far beyond body cams on ICE agents or we will continue to accept it as it expands to more and more and more Americans. And I think that that is one of my great critiques of not everyone in the Democratic Party at this moment, but there are so many people in leadership in the Democratic Party that won't even say that ICE needs to be abolished as an institution that has existed for, I think, less than 25 years. And so if we can't admit that this is just an escalation and expansion of violence, I don't want to say just, that this is a massive expansion and escalation of violence, but that the violence already existed and we were already accepting it, and we need like a fundamental rework of our punitive kind of detention centers in the United States broadly, that will not work. And I know sometimes people view that as almost like a leftist purity test thing, and it's not. It's that we saw what happened when the Democrats retook the presidency for a 4-year stint and didn't roll any of this stuff back, and instead accepted tough on the border language and accepted anti-crime rhetoric and dug down on it, which we've never seen a national level Democratic politician in my lifetime really talk about crime prevention, only crime punishment.
Yep.
And I think that what does give me some hope is that in some cities, I would say Chicago is one of them. I would say that a lot of the rhetoric that Zohran Mamdani ran on, in some cities we are seeing people talk about genuine crime prevention and community investment, and the reality that the best way to prevent people from acting out is to provide them with services and to treat them as human beings who are going through something, as opposed to coming in and treating people as inherently criminals. And we're seeing certain cities, Baltimore, Chicago, we're seeing cities implement policies that are focused on humanizing people and giving them the tools to prevent crime. And I think that all is not lost, but we need to expect a lot more from our elected leaders in terms of the solutions they're providing, or it will be.
Yeah. There's a unique model that I don't know if you're familiar with at all, but veterans treatment courts. When these things became popular, thanks to the global war on terror making so many more of us and the opportunity for many of us to do really bad shit, veteran treatment courts are unique in that they're just for veterans, and they consider things like post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury or any of these underlying conditions that may have contributed to, alleged misconduct or alleged law breaking. And societally, there is this patting ourselves on the back because we're like, oh, we're giving veterans a second chance. They've clearly got their veterans are all fucked up, is the way that people think of a lot of us. And when I first heard about these courts, I was like really fucking grateful and glad. But then I thought about the fucking hypocrisy where it's like, you shouldn't have to earn your citizenship. Like Starship Troopers is a fantasy novel about fascism, right? Like earning your citizenship by serving in combat is not the American way that we should be striving for. And I hope that more people start to see the good treatment that veterans get, this preventative treatment, like holistic healthcare. I have free healthcare for life because I'm a disabled veteran, and recognize that Americans shouldn't have to go to combat for that shit. Mm-hmm. And we'd all be in a fucking better place. Without unlimited access to healthcare, without the support of vocational rehabilitation, which is similar to the GI Bill, which I didn't qualify for a time until I later did. Without those things, I don't know if I'd be alive. I can say certainly, without access to the VA, I would not be alive today. And I have, regardless of what the Trump administration might think of me being a terrorist, I've accomplished a lot of fucking real good. I know that. I've passed laws that have helped millions of fucking people and will help countless people moving into the future. And that brings me to, where we started here, talking about you standing up against big institutions putting yourself at risk, putting your livelihood, your potential future opportunities at risk, putting your body physically on the line, showing up at these protests, getting pepper sprayed, having like real violence waged against you by the state. How is it that you think our listeners can go on offense? What is the way that they impose costs on these fascists? Like what do we do to punish or disincentivize the bad behavior of ICE as citizens? Because the Democrat Party has been like, well, you just need to vote in the midterms, and you and I know that that's not going to fix anything. I mean, it'll be good, it'll be better, but it's not going to fix ICE.
No, please vote in the midterms, but also please do not let that be the extent of your activism. And please vote in the primaries. Oh my God. And get these corporate Dems out of there. Get people who want to abolish ICE in. And okay, an abstract-ish answer, but I think it is baseline for what people need to do before they can go on offense. I would like every single person listening to this to take 5 minutes after the end of the episode and sit and ask yourself the question, in my vision of myself, my self-mythology, how I view myself, how I feel about myself, the story I tell myself, what do I think I would have done in the civil rights movement? What do I think I would have done in Nazi Germany? What risks would I have been willing to take? And be honest about that. And don't pretend that your self-conception is like, oh, I think I would have been on the front lines of resistance, if it's not, because that isn't where a lot of people are at. But I do think that the vast majority of us would answer that question with, I would be doing more. I would be standing up for my neighbors. I would be showing up. I would be participating in resistance. And then I think that the next thing that they come to is this idea of, well, how do I do that? What do I do? I would be doing that if I knew what to do. And that is a big portion of my own social media presence. I know it's a big goal of the podcast, is to give people specific tools. But I also just want to name that the people who were engaging in resistance at those times, the people who were showing up to civil rights protests, the people that were doing that work, they also didn't have a playbook that was handed to them. And history makes it sound like it was really neat and it was obvious what to do and you know exactly how to plug into the resistance. But that's just not true. And I think we have to get comfortable with that and kind of empower ourselves a little bit more to take action individually. That said, the most kind of entry point steps: get familiar with organizations in your city and community that do mutual aid, that provide services and supports to immigrants. Get plugged into those, especially if you're in a place that has not yet really come under fire by ICE and DHS in this moment. If you cannot find a mutual aid group in your neighborhood, consider starting one and having community meetings and knocking on doors and getting to know your neighbors. I would say, as much as you can, start divesting from big corporations. That is a really underutilized resource, and Amazon is so bad, y'all. It's so bad and so enabling, and there are other kind of boycott targets in this moment. I know Home Depot's on the list, AT&T, the places that have long-term contracts with ICE in this moment. The only way that we are going to drive corporations away from supporting this kind of work is by moving our dollars away. And the best way to do that, honestly, is to get in the habit of shopping small across the board as much as you can. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, this is, again, another like kind of question to yourself, but decide what your red lines are, because a lot of people think they'll know it when they see it, and then the moment comes and goes and they don't actually act because they're frozen. So what is it? What would it take for for a listener to go out and put their body on the line and get arrested? What would it take? Would it take the U.S. government grabbing people off the streets and shipping them to concentration camps? Because that's happening. So if that is where you think your lines are, get honest about them and get ready. and also do some Googling about protective equipment and how to treat pepper spray. Like, milk is actually not good for any of those things. There's lots of like conventional wisdom that's not actually true. Read up and think about what you thought you would be doing, and then get yourself ready and do it.
When you resigned from Skadden last year, did you envision where we are now at this scale, or have you been surprised along the way? Did you think it was going to be this bad?
No, I didn't. I thought that the administration would love to have it be this bad, but somehow, against all odds, I thought that people in power would stage a more effective resistance, and that more people with privilege would say that this was unacceptable.
Do you think that there's ever going to be accountability for what's happening today? Whether it's, an impeachment of Donald Trump or anybody in his cabinet, of ICE agents being identified years from now, thanks to investigators who are documenting all these things and putting the footage into storage where it can later be looked at just the same way that we found the January 6th insurrectionists, like going frame by frame. Do you see a future where America is holding everyone from the ICE agent committing assault and violating civil liberties to the politicians who are enabling it and the political appointees who are trying to encourage ICE agents to act violently by using phrases like absolute immunity?
Only if we start holding the Democratic Party accountable as voters. Only if we refuse to vote for Democrats who will not call for ICE abolition and structural change. If we continue to be led by Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, no, I don't see that as a future. Because we're currently being led by people who won't even unite around calling for the abolition of this organization when 73% of Democratic voters think that it should be abolished. And so we can get there, but it requires that we abandon this kind of vote blue no matter who psyop bullshit of not expecting anything from our leaders and instead hit the pavement in primaries and support people who are really calling for accountability, and do that not just this election cycle, but the next election cycle and the next, because it's not going to happen in 2 years. And if we do that, as well as showing up and slowing down operations so that we can continue to have free and fair elections, then yes, I think there is a future where there can be accountability. But it's not going to come if we just wait for someone to hold them accountable, right? Like, we all have to do our part in that.
Rachel Cohen, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really instructive. How is it that people can follow you, learn more about your work? Where can they read your writings? How can they follow you on social media? And how can they find out more about the things that you care about? We didn't get the opportunity to talk about American demands, but please share with the audience how folks can learn more about you and continue to learn more from you.
Absolutely. I am Cohen.489 everywhere except for Substack and Blue Sky, where I'm just Cohen489, no dot. I assume this will be cross-posted, and so you can just click over and follow me on Substack here. I am trying to write more consistently, but I post on Instagram and TikTok very consistently, and hope to continue to be in conversation, and so grateful for you having me, Kris, and all of your work.
Thank you. Are you going to accept Rachel's challenge? Are you going to push yourself out of your comfort zone, take risks, and make a difference? Will you be honest with yourself and work through what is truly a strategic compromise and what is cowardice? I hope so. That's what this show is for. Rachel Cohen isn't superhuman. She's not fearless. And she's someone who made the choice again and again to act, to resist, to intervene. And because she did, a lot of people who thought they couldn't do anything started believing they could. Now it's your turn. Whatever your comfort zone is, whatever lines you've drawn for yourself about what's too far or too risky, I want you to sit with that. I want you to ask if you've been waiting too long, if you've made peace with obedience disguised as some sort of strategy, if you've accepted injustice as someone else's problem. Because ICE isn't stopping. Trump isn't slowing down. And the people around him are already rewriting the rules of what the state can get away with. So here's your invitation. Get involved. Join a mutual aid group. Show up to a protest. Volunteer for Court Watch. Start an anti-fascist book club. Train your neighbors. Learn your rights. Push your limits. Do the thing that you've been putting off. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. And if this episode helped you see things more clearly, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Use it to start a conversation in your community. For more conversations like this, subscribe to On Offense on Substack, Apple, or Spotify. If you want an instruction manual to get started organizing from scratch, go to veteransfightingfascism.org and download our book list and the how-to guides for the Anti-Fascist Book Club, and shift some of your focus on politics into your community. I'm Kris Goldsmith, and this has been On Offense, produced for the VALOR Media Network. Thanks for being here. Now let's get to work.